The dog wasn't supposed to move. That was the first thing everyone understood when they arrived at the Remembrance Day ceremony at CFB Trenton that morning. The K9 units had been briefed, handlers had run through formation 3 times before the gates opened, and the dogs, 7 of them, all Belgian Malinois, all working military and RCMP service animals, had been positioned at the front of the plaza with the kind of discipline that made civilians stop mid-sentence just to watch. These weren't pets. These weren't even ordinary working dogs. These were animals that had been through things most humans couldn't imagine, trained to hold position, under gunfire, under chaos, under conditions that would make a grown man break. They didn't move unless commanded. And then the wind shifted. It came from the east side of the plaza, cutting through the rows of uniformed officers and veterans who'd gathered near the cenotaph, and it carried something with it, something invisible and impossible to explain to anyone who hadn't been watching what happened next. The dog closest to the crowd, a compact male named Arco, assigned to Corporal Dana Whitmore of the RCMP, lifted his nose. Just slightly. His ears rotated forward like satellite dishes locking onto a signal. His body, which had been perfectly still for 40 minutes, went rigid in a different way, not the trained stillness of a working animal. Something older than that. Nobody in the crowd noticed. They were watching the color guard, listening to the pipes, warming up somewhere behind the memorial wall, reading the names carved into the granite. The ceremony was about to begin. A provincial minister was adjusting his notes. Photographers jostled near the rope line. It was a grey November morning, the way southern Ontario does grey in November. Low sky, cold that got into your collar no matter how well you dressed for it. And then Arco pulled the leash straight out of Corporal Whitmore's grip and ran. The woman he ran toward was standing at the back of the plaza, near the chain-link fence that separated the public area from the parking lot. She was wearing a canvas barn jacket that had seen better decades, steel-toed work boots with dried mud still on them, and her dark hair was pulled back in a knot that had started coming loose sometime around the drive-in. She was 31 years old. Her name was Hazel Greer. She hadn't been invited. Siegs, that wasn't something she'd say to anyone who asked. She'd say she came to pay her respects, which was also true. She'd say she had family connections to the base, which was also true, though the family in question was complicated enough that she hadn't explained it to anyone in years. She'd driven 2.5 hours from a farm outside Napanee on a Tuesday morning, because something in her chest had told her she needed to be there, and she'd learned a long time ago to listen to that particular feeling. She was watching the cenotaph from a distance, arms crossed, keeping herself small near the fence. She wasn't in uniform. She didn't look like she belonged in the front rows. A few people had glanced at her when she first arrived and looked away again, categorizing her as someone who'd wandered in from the wrong direction. When Arco hit the end of his lead and kept going, she was the only one who didn't flinch. She crouched down as he reached her, not out of fear, but out of something that looked like recognition, and his front paws came up onto her shoulders, and his whole body shook with the kind of sound dogs make when language isn't enough. A high, broken whine, like something inside him had been wound too tight for too long and had finally let go. "Hey," she said quietly, into the fur at his neck. "Hey, I know. By that point, 2 other dogs had broken position. Corporal Whitmore was already moving, hand outstretched, face set in the controlled mortification of a professional whose animal has just done the one thing above all others it was not supposed to do. Behind her, handlers Sergeant Thomas Beaulieu and Constable Priya Nanku were both calling their dogs, a female named Vesper and a younger male named Can. In the flat, measured tones trained handlers use when they are trying very hard not to let anyone hear how rattled they are. Vesper didn't come back. Cairn stopped halfway between the formation and the fence, looked at his handler, looked at the woman crouching in the mud with her arms full of Malinois, and trotted the rest of the way over. The crowd had noticed by now. The pipes had stopped warming up. The provincial minister had lowered his notes. A ripple of uncertain murmuring moved through the rows of uniforms and dress coats and poppy-pinned lapels as people tried to figure out whether this was part of the ceremony or a significant operational failure. Corporal Whitmore reached the fence first. She was a compact woman in her mid-30s, close-cropped hair, the kind of bearing that suggested she could run 6 kilometers before most people finished their coffee, and she was furious in the controlled, behind-the-eyes way that RCMP officers learn early and practice constantly. "Ma'am," she said, "I'm going to need you to step back and let me retrieve my dog." Hazel looked up from where she was kneeling in the gravel with one hand on Arco's chest and another on Vesper's head, which had somehow arrived. "He came to me. I understand that." Whitmore crouched. Arco, heel. Arco's ears flattened. He pressed closer to Hazel. "He came to me," Hazel said again. There was nothing defiant in her voice. She wasn't making a point. She was just stating what had happened, the way you'd describe weather. Sergeant Beaulieu arrived then, slightly winded, and stopped when he saw the 3 dogs clustered around this one woman in a barn jacket like they were trying to cover her with their bodies. He'd been working K9 units for 11 years. He'd never seen anything like it, and his face said so before he could arrange it back into something professional. "Who are you?" he said. It was a reasonable question. It was also the wrong one, though Hazel would have been hard-pressed to explain why. She unfolded herself from the gravel, and when she stood up, Arco stayed pressed against her left leg. "Hazel Greer," she said. "I used to work with dogs." There was a woman at CFB Trenton named Lieutenant Colonel Maris Okafor who had been coordinating the ceremony logistics for 8 weeks and who had, in the last 45 minutes, handled a missing microphone, a conflict between 2 veterans' organizations over the order of wreath-laying, and a caterer who'd shown up 2 hours late with the wrong order of sandwiches. She was not, in other words, a woman who rattled easily. But when her staff sergeant came to find her with a radio in one hand and a look on his face she'd never seen before, she understood immediately that something had changed categories. "There's a civilian at the back fence," he said. 7 of the K9 units went to her. The handlers can't get them back into position. Maris looked at him. "All 7? "Yes, ma'am. They're in formation." They were. She set down her clipboard and walked. What she found at the back of the plaza was not chaos exactly. It was something more confusing than chaos. The 7 dogs, all of them, the full K9 contingent, were arranged around a single woman in a work jacket who was kneeling in the gravel with her eyes closed and both hands moving slowly, methodically, across the dogs as they pressed close to her. Not petting them, exactly. Something more deliberate. Checking them, checking their breathing, their muscle tension, the way their ears moved, the way a veterinarian moves, or a trainer who knows what she's looking for and has looked for it 10,000 times before. The handlers stood in a loose half-circle behind their animals, and they were not trying to call them back anymore. They were watching. Maris stopped at the edge of the group and said quietly to Corporal Whitmore, "What is this?" "I don't know, ma'am," Whitmore said. She sounded genuinely bewildered, which was unusual enough that Maris paid attention. "She says she used to work with dogs. The dogs," they recognized her, "ma'am." "Or something about her. I've never seen Arco do that." Maris looked at the woman. "What's her name?" "Greer. Hazel Greer." Something shifted at the back of Maris's memory, the kind of shift that feels like almost knowing, like a name on the tip of your tongue. She filed it away and walked forward. "Miss Greer," she said. Hazel opened her eyes. They were dark and steady and a little too old for her face, the kind of eyes that had seen things quietly and without ceremony. "Lieutenant Colonel," she said, reading the insignia, "what are you doing here?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a real question, asked by a woman who needed a real answer. Hazel was quiet for a moment. Her hand was still resting on the back of a dog named Cairn, who had pressed his head against her knee and closed his eyes. My father was stationed here, she said finally. He served 2 rotations in Afghanistan. His unit used K9 support both times. She paused. He died in March. I came because... I don't know. I came because I wanted to be somewhere he would have recognized. Maris looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the 7 dogs. Then she looked back at Hazel. Your father's name, she said. Robert Greer, Hazel said. Chief Warrant Officer Robert Greer. The shift in Maris's memory resolved into something solid and clear. She had known that name. She still did. Robert Greer had retired from the Canadian Armed Forces in 2019 after 26 years of service, the last 12 of which had been spent as one of the most respected dog handlers in the country. That wasn't hyperbole. It was a statement that multiple people had made, independently, in the weeks after his death, when the tributes had come in from units in 3 provinces and 2 overseas deployments. He'd trained animals that had gone on to serve with RCMP, with border services, with military units across the country. He'd trained them in detection, in search and rescue, in patrol work, in the kind of deep, almost intuitive responsiveness that couldn't be reduced to any training protocol. He'd had a way with dogs that people who'd worked with him for years still struggled to articulate. He just knew them, Sergeant Beaulieu said, later, to anyone who would listen. You know how some people are with kids, how certain kids just run to certain people, and you don't know why, and you can't explain it, and there's nothing you can do about it. That was Bob with dogs, every time. After his retirement, Robert had gone back to the farm outside Napanee, where he and his wife had raised Hazel and her 2 brothers, and he'd kept working with animals. Not officially, not as a contractor or a civilian trainer, but informally, the way a retired carpenter might still pick up a piece of wood when it needed to be shaped. Local police units had called him when they had problem animals. Search and rescue had borrowed his expertise during training cycles. He'd driven 3 hours to Belleville once to help a handler whose dog had developed a fear response no one could get past, and he'd had the dog working normally within 2 days. He'd never asked for payment. He hadn't needed recognition. He'd been doing a thing he was made to do, and the doing of it had been enough. Hazel had known all of this. She'd grown up with it. She could still remember being 9 years old and watching her father sit in silence with a dog that had been pulled from an abusive situation, not touching it, not talking to it, just being near it, until the dog chose on its own to inch forward and put its nose on his knee. She'd asked him what he was doing. Waiting, he'd said. For what? For it to know I'm not going anywhere. She'd thought about that answer every year since, at different ages, with different understanding each time. When he died, a stroke in the early morning of a March day, fast and without warning, the farm had gone quiet in a way she'd never experienced before. She'd driven down from where she was living in Kingston, and she'd stayed for 3 weeks, helping her mother manage the paperwork and the animals and the particular grief of losing someone who had been so reliably, solidly present that his absence felt structurally wrong, like a wall missing from a building. Her brothers had come and gone. She'd stayed. She hadn't known what to do with herself afterward. She was 31. She'd done 2 years of veterinary science before leaving school to work on a wildlife rehabilitation project in northern Ontario. She'd come back for her mother. She'd been helping to run the farm since the spring. She hadn't been back to CFB Trenton since she was a teenager. He trained some of these dogs, Maris said. It wasn't a question. I didn't know for sure, Hazel said. I thought he might have. He mentioned Trenton a few times in the last couple of years. Didn't tell me details. Maris turned to Sergeant Beaulieu, Arco's training file. Who certified him? Beaulieu was already on his radio. The answer came back in under a minute, and when it did, something crossed his face that Hazel couldn't quite read. Greer, he said. Far Greer, civilian contractor. He recertified Arco and 2 other dogs in the unit 2 years ago. He recertified Vespa 18 months ago. He looked at Hazel. He was here 4 times in the past 3 years. It's in the records. Nobody said anything for a moment. Hazel was looking down at Arco, who was still pressed against her leg, his dark eyes half closed. She thought about what her father had said about waiting. She thought about the fact that these animals had spent years learning the shape of his hands, the cadence of his voice, the particular frequency of attention he gave to living things. She thought about the fact that they recognized her. Not precisely, not exactly, but close enough. Close enough that some animal part of them had said, "This is known. This is ours." "He said once," she said quietly, "that a dog doesn't forget who loved it first." No one in the half-circle moved. He said you could take a dog anywhere, train it with anyone, put it through 100 different handlers, and it would still remember. Not the person exactly, maybe. But the feeling of being seen, Corporal Whitmore made a sound that she immediately suppressed. A souse. "He would have hated a fuss," Hazel added, looking up. Her eyes were dry, but barely. "He really, genuinely would have hated this." Lieutenant Colonel Maris Okafor had the kind of authority that made things happen quickly when she decided they needed to. She had, in the course of her career, rerouted supply chains, resolved diplomatic incidents involving 3 jurisdictions, and once managed a live press situation that had been 48 hours away from becoming a national story. She was not a woman who did things halfway. She made 2 calls. The first was to her logistics coordinator, who adjusted the ceremony program by 8 minutes. The second was to the officer managing the cenotaph proceedings, who listened without interrupting and said simply, "Tell me what you need." Hazel didn't find out what was happening until Maris walked back to where she was standing near the fence and said, "The ceremony is starting in 10 minutes. I'd like you to stand with the K9 unit." Hazel stared at her. "Huh. I'm not military. I shouldn't be. You're the daughter of Chief Warrant Officer Robert Greer," Maris said, "who trained 4 of the 7 dogs in active service today. You have every right to be here, and frankly, given what just happened, I think the dogs have already decided the question for us." A very small, very controlled smile crossed her face. "Come." They walked together through the rows of people who had been watching the whole thing unfold, and who now parted, not with ceremony, not with any particular drama, just with the instinctive deference that crowds give to people who are clearly going somewhere with purpose. Hazel was aware of eyes on her. She kept her gaze forward. The K9 unit reformed around her, not in the same configuration as before. The handlers reclaimed their dogs. Leashes were reclipped, positions were adjusted, but Arco stayed on Hazel's left, and Corporal Whitmore, after a moment, didn't fight it. The pipes started. There is a particular quality to a Remembrance Day ceremony at a military base, something different from the civilian commemorations held in town squares and school gymnasiums across the country. It's not more solemn, exactly. It's more inhabited. The people standing in those rows know what the names on the granite mean in a way that isn't theoretical. They know it from years of service and loss that aren't always visible from the outside, grief that gets folded into routine because there's no other place to put it, and the work still has to get done. When the bugler plays Last Post at a ceremony like this one, it's not just a tradition, it's an acknowledgement between people who share something that doesn't always have words. Hazel stood in formation with the K9 unit and felt it settle over her. She hadn't cried at her father's funeral. She'd been too busy managing her mother, managing the details, managing the stream of people who kept arriving at the house with casseroles and condolences that she accepted graciously and then set aside to fold laundry. Because the laundry kept needing to be done and folding it was something she could do well. She'd cried twice since, both times alone in the barn, at 3 in the morning, for reasons she hadn't fully understood. She thought she understood a little better now. She was standing in the place her father had stood. She was surrounded by animals that carried the mark of his hands. She could feel Arco against her leg, the warm solidity of him, and she thought, "He knew this dog. He stood where I'm standing. He was here." The bugle sounded. Arco lifted his head, and didn't look at the cenotaph. He looked at her. 2 minutes of silence in late November at a military base is a long time, long enough to feel the cold working through your jacket collar, long enough to hear the flag at the top of the pole snapping in the wind, long enough to think about a man sitting in a farmyard in the early morning with a dog he was teaching to trust him, patient as stone, going nowhere. Hazel breathed. When the silence broke, there was a moment, just a moment, before the ceremony resumed, where the crowd seemed to hold its breath collectively. And in that moment, Sergeant Beaulieu, who had 11 years in K9 and was not by any standard a sentimental man, caught Corporal Whitmore's eye and didn't say anything. He didn't need to. After the wreath-laying and the singing and the formal proceedings concluded, there was a reception in the base hall, coffee and sandwiches, and the gradual easing of ceremony into something quieter and more human. Maris found Hazel standing near a table with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, Arco sitting on her foot. "You should know," Maris said, "that I'm going to be writing up what happened today. For the record, I want it documented." Hazel looked at her. "Why?" "Because Robert Greer spent years making this unit better, and he was never formally recognized for any of it. He was a civilian contractor. He wasn't in the chain. He didn't ask for anything." Maris paused. "That's the kind of contribution that disappears from the record if no one writes it down." Hazel was quiet for a while. Outside, through the windows of the hall, she could see the cenotaph and the names carved into it, stone against a November sky. "He wouldn't have cared," she said, "about being recognized." "I know," Maris said. "That's usually how it works." Around them, handlers were moving through the room, some of them stopping near Hazel with the slightly awkward purposefulness of people who have something they want to say and aren't sure how. Sergeant Beaulieu introduced himself formally, shook her hand. Constable Nanku told her that Vesper, the dog whose leash had gone taut in Hazel's direction before she'd finally been called back, had been washed out of 2 previous placements before her father had worked with her, and that she'd been a different animal since. "He spent 6 weeks on her," Nanku said. "Came out 3 times. Wouldn't take payment. My supervisor at the time didn't even know how to process it." She paused. "She's one of the best dogs I've ever worked with." A younger handler, barely 20, with the look of someone on their first posting, came up and said, haltingly, that his dog Cairn had been trained from the start by a contractor named Greer, and that he'd always wondered who that was, that the dog had come to him with better foundations than any animal he'd heard of, and that nobody had been able to tell him much about it. He had a thing about that, Hazel said. She was looking at Cairn, who had somehow migrated back to her vicinity and was sitting with his head tilted slightly, the way dogs do when they're working something out. He always said the dog had to trust the new handler, not remember the old one. He was very deliberate about finishing his work cleanly and stepping back. He didn't want them looking over their shoulder for him. The young handler nodded slowly. Then he said, "Do you think it worked? Like, do you think they forgot him?" Hazel looked around the room, at the dogs, at the impeccable, impossible thing that had happened that morning in the plaza, in front of 200 people and a provincial minister and a color guard and a cenotaph bearing the names of the dead. "What do you think?" she said. He thought about it for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't think they did." "No," she agreed. "I don't think they did either." She stayed later than she'd planned. Her mother called twice, and she answered both times, standing outside in the cold with her hand on Arco's head, telling her mother where she was, hearing the complicated pause on the other end of the line, and understanding everything in it. "He would have liked it," Hazel said. "Being here, he would have complained about the cold and the speeches, but he would have liked it." Her mother laughed, which was the right sound for that particular moment. She drove back to Napanee in the dark, the heater running, the highway empty the way highways are in November, when everyone sensible has gone inside. She kept thinking about the moment when Arco had run, about the instant before she'd seen him coming, the way some part of her had braced, or softened in the second before she understood what was happening, as though she'd heard him without hearing him, as though something in her had known before her eyes had caught up. Her father would have found that perfectly unremarkable. He'd have nodded and said something like, "They're doing what they were built to do. They're going where it's safe." And she thought that was probably right. She thought that was probably the most accurate thing she could say about it. But she also thought about a winter morning when she was 12, and a dog in the farmyard that wouldn't come inside, and her father sitting in the snow for over an hour, just waiting. Patient, present, giving the animal every reason to believe he would still be there, in the same place, with the same steadiness, whenever it was finally ready to come. He had been like that with everything, with animals, with her brothers. With her, it was the thing she was going to miss most, more than the specific things, more than his voice or his face, or the way he could fix anything mechanical, with enough time and patience. She was going to miss the steadiness, the absolute certainty that when you came back, he would still be there. The highway went on ahead of her, and the dark went on around that, and the fields on either side were cold and flat and bare in the way of late November, waiting for winter, waiting for spring, holding on. She turned the radio on low. She drove. When she got home, she turned the barn light on before she went inside the way her father always had. A habit of his she'd absorbed without knowing it. The idea that light in the dark was never wasted, that something out there might need to find its way. She left it burning.